All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and I am your host for this evening's exciting program. I am thrilled, as always, to have Dr. Jerry Bergman, a former atheist who rejected evolution and naturalism based on the incredible evidence for creation. In his rejection of evolution, he converted to Christianity. Dr. Bergman is a frequent guest here on Standing for Truth. His work has been a true blessing to this ministry. And I am really looking forward to today's topic, From Atheist to Christian Professor: Why Evolution is False. Now, for those that might be new to this channel and they want to see more from Dr. Jerry Bergman, please do check the description box of this video and also our main website, standingfortruthministries.com, for links to all of his previous programs here on the channel. We've done talks on debunking human evolution, viruses, bacteria, and God. Why did God create viruses and bacteria? We've done programs focusing on C.S. Lewis being an anti-Darwinist. So there's plenty of content for you to enjoy coming from Dr. Bergman. Now, before I hand it to Jerry here for his talk, I do want to give him a formal introduction. Dr. Jerry Bergman has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology for over 40 years at several colleges and universities, including Bowling Green State University Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in experimental pathology, and the University of Toledo. He is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and 40 books and monographs. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he authored are in over 1,800 college libraries in 27 countries. So far, over 80,000 copies of the 60 books and monographs that he has authored or co-authored are in print. And Dr. Bergman is diligent in putting out articles and material on the creation versus evolution debate frequently. And so once we finish his presentation, I have several points and questions that we are going to engage based on some of the work that he's recently put out, articles, and one specific technical article in the Answers Research Journal. Jerry, my brother, it's great to have you as always. How have you been since the last time you were here?
Doing pretty well. Had a little cough I've been working with. I think I'm allergic to something, but we'll see if we can't get through this without too much interference.
No worries, Jerry. Not only myself, but the audience, you are a fan favorite, so we always look forward to having you here. You're a wealth of knowledge, very well-rounded, as we can discuss and go back and forth on numerous topics, which is what we are going to be doing here today. So I'm excited, Jerry. I'm going to hand it over to you, brother. Whenever you're ready, please let me know, and we can get your presentation ready.
Okay, I'm ready. Can you see the title slide?
I can see the title slide. Maybe one recommendation. I'm not sure if you can see that little box at the bottom. There is a button that says hide.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, it might have. There we go. We're good to go.
Okay. I'll start with the scripture, Romans 1:20. But invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. To translate this into English, basically, the creation all around us tells us about the Creator. And therefore, we are without excuse because we can see the creation, we can study the creation, and that tells us a lot about the Creator. Very simply. And I'll skip some of these slides. Oh, Dr. Richard Dawkins, he had an interesting statement. He said there are no Christians, as far as I know, blowing up buildings. Basically saying that, boy, you know, we the atheists are critical of Christians, but yet in many ways they aren't as bad as other worldviews. But moving on to my own experience, my father, who was very influential in my life, was an atheist, or he never really came out and said he was an atheist. That just, you know, that many atheists don't come out and say, well, gee, I'm an atheist. That is their belief. They live that life, but they don't broadcast that name. My mother, though, went along with my dad. And my first trip to Sunday school, I was I think about age 5. And I went there with my brother, who was a couple years older than me. And my dad, when he found out, blew his top. And that was the first argument I remember my parents having. And unfortunately, later on, my dad said, it's not going back. And so that was my experience with the church. Very quick, short, but very profound in a sense, because the gospel was presented at that time and on felt board. And I remember accepting the gospel of Jesus as my savior when I was age 5. Well, I was really in many ways more like the prodigal son, which, by the way, when I go out and speak at other churches, I find that there are a lot of prodigal sons out there. So I don't feel so alone. People say, hey, you and me and many other people. Unfortunately, that is the journey many of us take. On the other side, I've been on the other side. And so I know what the other side, the atheist side, is. And as a result, people who have been on the other side tend to be more effective because they've lived, they have been part of the other side. In my case, the atheist side. And therefore, I can relate to my experience. I can also be more sympathetic and supportive of other people who are on the same side I was. My first love was books. I read a lot for most of my life, even when I was in, I guess, first grade. When we went to the supermarket, I always bugged my mother for a book. Back then, we had the little golden books, which were for kids, but that's what I wanted. And I read about a book a week for years. Moving on. In fact, my first love, besides books, was going to used bookstores. And I spent much of my life visiting used bookstores. They're cheaper than new bookstores is part of the purpose. But okay, why I left the faith. College genetics class, I remember this to this day. The genetics professor was a big, tall, imposing man, had his PhD from Cornell University, and he made it very clear we were not created, we evolved. And he spent much of the rest of his class trying to present this. And my paleontological book, I noticed specifically, it had pictures of our supposed evolutionary ancestors. And I looked at that and I thought, you know, it looks pretty good. I mean, there you go. You've got models of heads of our ancestors. They're physically there. Must be true. And as a college professor, though, I accepted the beliefs of my father. But I have to admit, I never was 100% atheist. Maybe 99%, but not 100% atheist. I think I always had problems with the atheist worldview, which later on, of course, became greater. I was the faculty advisor to the University Atheists to indicate the involvement I was in at that time. And this is the kind of evidence that was, to me, very convincing. But of course, I was at this time naive. You can see here the skulls. And we start out with a very ape-like creature, and we end up with a very modern man-type creature. Pretty impressive. To one is not naive. To one who is naive. Of course, now I understand that a lot of these are distortions. They are not really fully accurate depictions. They're based on fragments of the skull, and rarely, in most cases, do they have the whole skull there. And since then, since I left the atheist movement, I recognize the importance of Darwinism. And I wrote this book here called Darwinism is the Doorway to Atheism. And indeed, I list probably 60 cases of people who became atheists as a result of their exposure to Darwin. I must acknowledge, though, that I got this phrase when I worked with Madeleine Murray O'Hara, who is probably one of the most, well, was the most famous atheist in the United States for decades. And I worked with her. I published through her quite a few articles, and I got along, very wealthy with her because got along very well with her because she liked everything I wrote. In fact, she published everything I wrote. Get some water here. And when I asked her why we published so much in our atheist magazines about evolution, she said, well, evolution or Darwinism is the doorway to atheism. And so we realized the importance of that worldview in helping people become atheists. And then as a counter to that, I wrote a book, Science is the Doorway to the Creator. And these were all people who, through studying science, purely science, recognized, well, as Romans does state, recognize that the heavens declare the glory of God. And they saw, in studying God's creation, they saw clear evidence for the Creator. And many of these were atheists. And I talk about why they rejected the atheist worldview in their books. Okay. When I was involved in the atheist movement, I read their literature greatly, vociferously. I published probably 50 articles, close to that, in the leading atheist journals, and worked with many leading atheists. Gordon Stein, I worked very closely with him. Gary DeYoung, who is kind of a renegade in a sense, I worked closely with him. Kind of felt sorry for him because he wasn't treated very well by the other atheists. Why did I leave? Well, one thing was, as I read more, I found their literature is, in so many areas, inaccurate. A good example is the Crusades, the Inquisition. The Inquisition is widely believed as a bunch of evil churchmen who were torturing innocent Christians for no reason. And in fact, the story is very, very different from that. The Inquisition basically was a response to the treatment that was in most countries at that at that time. And basically the government was not to, well, some of the means they used to determine guilt were sorry, I started talking, this cough would come up, but get some water here. They thought they could determine guilt of someone by torturing him, and then he would admit or state he was guilty or try to rationalize what he did. And indeed, the Inquisition, the idea from the word inquire, the whole point of the Inquisition was to do a search, a research, interview individuals involved, try to find evidence for guilt, physical and other evidence for guilt, and not rely upon the techniques that were used previously. And so the Inquisition, surprisingly, is the basis for our own judicial system in this country. We don't accuse someone, not supposed to at least. We find evidence, and only do we convict when we have good, clear evidence. And so the goal was to find evidence. And in the end, the goal was to help bring people back to Christ in the church. And there were some executions, but many of these that were executed would also be executed today under our system because they committed crimes like murder and rape and so on. And so therefore, many were, in essence, would be guilty of crimes that we would justify a strong punishment. Okay, there is, you can see Madeleine Murray O'Hara. Her goal was to get religion out of the public square, like the Ten Commandments, then get In God We Trust off the coins. And then basically she wanted to eliminate the Christian worldview from wherever she could. And I felt, well, why not leave alone? it bothered me that their inquisitional methods were the ones they used. Let's stop religion. Let's do it by the law, by the courts, by government decree, etc. My feeling even then was, if they want to believe in God, fine. If they don't, then fine. We should not try to stop them from believing in God or whatever by these methods. So that bothered me, to be honest. And moving on, even though I was an atheist, I had a difficult time with their vision for society. So in time, I became very disenchanted with the movement. Mostly, though, because as I read more and more, I realized that so many of their views were incorrect. Atheists like to present themselves as being highly intelligent, well-read, well-balanced people, but in so many ways, they were not always that well-read. They were not always that intelligent. It was hard to reason with some of them, and therefore I became disillusioned with some of them, the persons, although I respected many of them when I was in the movement. And they respected me. Madeline Murray O'Hare said I was quite a catch in the movement, which is, kind of nice to say. Anyways, these are magazines I published in. Skeptical Inquirer is a well-known magazine where I published several articles. American Atheist, I published, again, several articles in that magazine. And as I read more and more, I realized that so many of the ideas that evolutionists taught were not true. And one thing that struck me at first was evolution had in their history so many blunders, frauds, and forgeries. And I found that there was not always the honesty we would expect. In fact, there is, in many cases, a great deal of dishonesty. They were concerned about pushing their worldview, pushing it upon you, and come hell or high water, you were going to believe these world views, whether or not you really resisted or not. How is that done? By court decree, by suppression of Christianity, of Christian ideas, and Christian people. And so that bothered me. But as I moved on, I realized that the case against atheism was overwhelming. And that was based on science alone. The evidence for Darwinism simply did not hold up on the research that I was doing. And many of the books I read were not books by creationists, but they were books by evolutionists. And even in the books by evolutionists, there is a credibly good case against evolution in those books. The difference is they believed in evolution. And when they wrote books about the evolution of some animal, they admitted that we don't have evidence for the evolution for this animal, but they believed in evolution, and they believe we'll find it eventually, or well, if we don't, we still know that the animal evolved from some animal before that time. And therefore, that I can read books by evolutionists and you can find a good case for creationism. People find that surprising, I suppose, but it's really not, because many scientists are open and honest, and they will, in trying to find a case for evolution, they'll admit we don't have it. We don't have the evidence. But of course, they believe that it's there. The evidence is there, so therefore we simply have to keep working until we find it. And my struggle, it's not easy because you're changing your worldview. Atheism has a worldview. It says that we basically, where we come from, we evolved. Why are we here? We're here to survive. Where are we going? When we die, we die. When we die, and that's it. Christianity, of course, has a very different worldview. Where do we come from? We were created by God. Why are we here? To serve our Creator and our fellow man. Where are we going? Life everlasting, either in hell, heaven, or hell. So they both have worldviews, but the evolutionary worldview is very, very different from the Christian worldview. Moving on to next slide. Let my throat rest a little bit here. I'll be out in Indianapolis all next week speaking. I hope I can get through it, but I guess we'll see. So my conclusion was research, scientific research, is very clear. Darwinism is false. What is true then? If Darwinism is false, if there is no evolution, if that does not explain our origins. Therefore, the other worldview is, and there's only two, either Darwinism does explain our worldview, or if that's false, then of course the Christian view that we have a creator who created us, etc., is true. And so elimination of one, and some people say, well, there's some in between. Well, there is, but when we dichotomize the Darwinian worldview and the Christian worldview, there is a major gap between them. Many people believe in Christianity because they grew up that way, and that's okay, but I find that those who grew up as Christians, sometimes they are not as resilient. They accept it because they were told this, whereas one who was on both sides, as I mentioned before, has seen both sides, and they accept the Christian worldview because of evidence. And so evidence is very, very important. And there are hundreds of people, I could mention hundreds, but C.S. Lewis, Chuck Colson, Lee Strobel, Marvin Olasky are a few of those, many who were atheists and became Christians. And as a result of their background, they were very effective in their ministry. As you know, all these people were very effective because they've been on both sides, so to speak. Okay, the empirical evidence convinced me. And that is a problem when you're trying to, churches help them see the importance of looking at the evidence. So many Christians, unfortunately, say, well, just believe, just have faith. Where's your faith? Well, faith is important, but on the other hand, we need to have evidence, as the scriptures state. And this evidence plus the faith will bridge the gap between one view and the other view, the other worldview. So we need to look at all the evidence, which is what I did. And by 2021, about 70% of Americans were creationists. About half both scientists believe that the Bible is an ancient book of fables. So we see a contrast, a couple of years ago, a contrast between the worldview of scientists and the worldview of Christians. And scientists are far less likely to believe in God than ordinary Americans. In fact, one study found, now these were eminent scientists, 98.7% of the eminent scientists were evolutionary biologists. Why, again, is this case? Because they only see one side. They rarely see both sides. And the school system is such in America, as they are given only in the schools one side. They're indoctrinated. They do not see evidence for the other side. And this I see as a tragedy of our school systems. Instead of educating, they all too often indoctrinate. And that's a big problem in schools, at least in the States, and probably in Canada and Australia as well. Okay, moving on. Next slide. So the question is, are we the product of an intelligent designer, or are we not the product of an intelligent designer? And this dichotomy, one statement must be true. If so, the other must be false. And so therefore, this contrast is what I look at over and over. I look at two worldviews and which one is correct, thus proving the other one incorrect. In this case, it's very obvious in the wording I used, but on the other hand, this is common. Okay, the anti-Christian movement. Now that I'm on the other side, I can see this is a problem. And this lecture, for example, that I'm giving you right now would be illegal in public schools. You could not state most of the things I'm stating in a public school system, at least in America. And this has been consistently held up by the courts with no exception. There's been about 200 and some court cases in America which basically looked at whether or not you can present both sides of this worldview. And the courts have consistently said, no, you must present only one side, the evolution side, because that's science. You can't present the other side because the other side is religion. And so they're labeling one side as science, the other side as religion, when of course both sides are partially religion and both sides are partially science. And so you cannot dichotomize appropriately as is commonly done in the States. When I was teaching at Bowling Green State University, I wrote this booklet teaching about the creation evolution controversy. And this was my first attempt to try to publish my ideas. Now, in this booklet, I was not pushing creation. I was objectively trying to analyze the debate between creation and evolution. And ironically, my colleagues at Bowling Green State University could not accept that at all. You do not present evidence in favor of the creation worldview. You only can present evidence in favor of the evolutionary worldview. And actually, when I wrote this, I was to some degree an agnostic. I was still moving from one worldview to the other worldview. And yet even that position, which is pretty clear in the monograph, they could not accept, they could not deal with. And later on, I was terminated from the university, and they made it very clear that this fastback I produced was a major reason, major problem that I had at the university. That was Bowling Green State University. And this, by the way, is the fastback done by Phi Delta Kappa, which is in many ways a very prestigious publication. And my colleagues admitted that. They said, yes, this is a very, it's very prestigious, much better than most of our publications. They admitted that, but on the other hand, they simply could not deal with the position that I took and could not understand why Phi Delta Kappa published it. Well, the fact is, they did. By the way, this is found in thousands of libraries, and I was at the Catholic University in Ohio, and I just for curiosity looked to see what they had about me and about my publications, and I found the fastback in the library, and a lot of notes were in the fastback. The reader put them in there, basically good point or good idea and good thinking. Obviously, my fastback influenced them quite a bit. I think it was the University of Dayton that this was at, which is a Catholic school. Since then, since my own experiences of intolerance, because of my new worldview, I wrote 3 books, actually. And this is one, Slaughter of the Dissidents, which is done fairly well, showing indeed that this is a common problem. If evolutionists are right, give us the evidence. Why do they have to terminate those who question their worldview? Why do they have to react the way they do? To me, it didn't make sense. If they're right, give us the evidence and we'll accept their worldview. If they're wrong, well, then they should admit they're wrong and we should have the right to accept another worldview. A lot of the publicity I got was fairly positive. This is the Toledo Blade, which has a main newspaper in Toledo, and I got a front page article, Film Adding to Debate Over Intelligent Design. And the author of this article, I've later on found, was favorable to our worldview, and this is pretty obvious in reading the article. And this is a picture of me when I was teaching at the university, and you can see the bookshelf behind me, which shows these books. So to try to summarize the evidence that convinced me that creation must be correct. One is the problem has not been the survival of the fittest. Obviously, if you're more fit, by definition, you're going to be more likely to survive. That's not the issue. That's obvious, and that doesn't need any proof. That's an obvious statement. It's almost like saying rich men are men that have a lot of money. Well, you're saying the same thing. So survival of the fittest is not the concern, but the arrival of the fittest is. And the fact is that Darwin could not figure out the arrival of the fittest. He ignored the problem. And basically, he kind of skirted around it. And when he did so, he really could not articulate where the arrival of the fittest could be. The most he could say is there's a lot of variety in the natural world. Well, yeah, there is, but where did that come from? What explains it? And so Darwin did not know the origin of the species, which of course is the arrival of the fittest. And now we know the problem with the arrival of the fittest is that the explanation is mutations. The problem is 99.9% of all mutations are near neutral or deleterious. And mutations are what causes aging. You don't have mutations, you're not going to age. Aging is purely a result of mutations in the cells in your body. You have more and more mutations, and aging thus obviously increases. And so therefore, we know that from other research. I worked at medical school doing research in mutations, and it was very clear to me, well, very clear to all of us, that the vast majority of mutations were harmful. And we knew why. We study mutations. We know a great deal about mutations. And we know that they will not make things better. They will virtually always make things worse. And that's given in the whole field of mutational research. And we know why that's true. One quick example, we know that's true because mutations tend to occur in hotspots. And that means you're not going to get changes throughout the genome. You get changes only or primarily in certain places. Well, you get mutations, it damages the gene, but it's not going to improve things because it only causes damage in small areas. And some genes like P53, one of the most well-known examples, there is one hotspot which like 90% of all mutations occur. Other genes, there may be 3 hotspots, but invariably my guess is that every gene has hotspots. Every gene has this issue. Don't know this because I haven't looked carefully at every gene, but nonetheless, it's pretty clear to me that every gene is going to have hotspots, and therefore you'll never get the changes you need in order to produce a new gene. It's not going to happen. Okay, and of course, aging is the best example, and in cancer, which I already talked about. And here you can see a man aging, and so those changes, which are in every cell of the body, the changes are occurring, and that's why aging is everywhere, pretty much. Although aging is faster in some persons than others, but that doesn't say it doesn't occur. It just occurs slower because some people have a greater resistance against mutations. So evolution is true, but going the wrong way. In other words, we're not evolving better, we're evolving worse because of the accumulation of mutations. And that's one reason that species go extinct is because of the accumulation of mutations. So that's getting into another topic, but on the other hand, we know that mutations are harmful. The vast majority of cases, near neutral means that they're not lethal. They don't kill you, but they add up. And therefore, after a while, you have more and more mutations. Okay, moving on. As Mayer said, ultimately, all variation is due to mutation. So they admit that, scientists admit that that's how evolution works, by mutation. Well, it can't. It's not going to work. So it was clear to me that evolution is not true. It could not be true, could never have occurred, and that is a result of science. And certainly when I worked at the medical school, that was obvious. And I didn't really talk about religion there and the creation belief, but we knew that it causes a problem. When you say we discovered a mutation, nobody says, oh, gee, are they evolving into something better? But we knew there's a mutation that occurred. It's a problem, or it could be a problem, or could be one of many mutations which could add up and be a problem. Okay, I guess I can probably, 2 books. The idea is that God revealed his word to us by 2 ways. One is his word, the Bible. The second is his works. And unfortunately, many churches ignore totally or largely his works. God reveals himself through his creation, through his works. And I think churches are really falling short when they focus totally upon his words and ignore his works, his creation. It's as a nature lover as I was and am today, you can see God in his creation. A good example is the dog. How many people in the world have dogs? About 1 billion people have pet dogs, 1 billion people or more. And you can see with your dog, you can see that dogs were specifically created for our needs. And I've written a number of articles about this, and think about it. They're specifically created just for our needs. And there are 3 animals, especially that's true: dogs, horses, and cats. And they all have very different roles, very different roles. It always amazed me how a 120-pound girl could run the life of a, turn the phone off, could, I'm sorry.
I think that might be the atheist giving you a call, Jerry,
Yeah.
because you're dismantling their
It
position,
could be.
brother.
But it always amazed me that a 120-pound girl could control a horse. And you see this everywhere when the horse basically becomes affectionate to the girl, and the girl becomes affectionate, stroking him and giving him treats and so on. And you can see the relationship that horses develop for people are quite close, but yet horses rarely, they can cause damage, of course. They can get upset or make mistakes. But on the other hand, they are made specifically to obey humans. And there's one film which illustrates this quite well. And the film, basically, the man argues that there's no such thing as a wild horse, period. Doesn't exist. All horses are tame. And so to prove this, he brought what was called a wild horse, brought it in. He said, within the day, I'm going to be riding this horse bareback. And people said, no way. You got to train it. You have to train the horse. And in the film, they sped it up, of course. In the film, they showed how he did it. And at the end of the day, he was back on that horse. And that horse was as tame as can be. Even though, as far as they knew, that horse had never been associated with people. The horse was a wild horse out west, spent, as far as they knew, his lifetime with other wild horses. That he was not a tame horse. And his point was, and he wasn't pushing any idea, except he was trying to say very clearly that all horses are tame. It may take you a day or so to train him, and of course he was good at that, so he could train the horse within a few hours. But because we talk about wild animals and trained animals, well, many animals like dogs as well and cats are tame normally. Now, if you have a feral cat, that can be a problem. They're not too friendly. Well, that's for their protection. On the other hand, I've known people, and I'm sure you have as well, that took in a feral cat and took the cat a while. But eventually the cat became a purring, friendly house cat, even though it was a mean feral cat previous to this. And it may take a while. But on the other hand, of course, all dogs, cats, and horses, they have to have defenses in the wild. So they have to be able to survive in the wild. But nonetheless, specifically, they can be tamed quite easily, especially when they're very young. Cats or dogs are very young and they're brought up by one or two people. And so, and there's no other animal that fits that category. I guess rabbits are kind of that way, but specifically those three animals God created specifically for us. And I've done a number of presentations on this. Invariably, I have people raise their hand and say, yes, I agree. This is good evidence that there's a creator who created this animal specifically for us. Now, if you're not a dog lover or dog owner, you may not, understand where that's coming from. And dogs love to serve people. They're happy when they're just doing things. They're happy when they're working for their master. That's what makes them happy. And unfortunately, a lot of dogs sit around all day because we allow them to do so. But dogs that are trained to work dogs, tend to be happier dogs, and they're happier working for their master than dogs that just sit around all day. And so, anyways, it's going into something else, but and there's I'm not sure why I have this picture in here, but at any rate, any questions?
Absolutely, Jerry. Excellent presentation. That T-Rex, I think the atheist might want you to have feathers on that, brother.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that got in there. But
so, yeah, I'll get your slides off. If you click the bottom of the screen, it should take you back to where we are in the StreamYard. And you can click stop screen should work.
Stop screen, okay.
Okay, well,
okay.
Jerry, as always, brother, excellent presentation, fantastic points. I do have just about 10 hours worth of questions for you. So get comfortable, Dr. Bergman.
That's fine.
I love having these discussions with you. And so directly on your presentation, a couple of questions come to mind, and they're based on your slide that talks about deleterious mutation accumulation, how the majority of mutations are nearly neutral, which means they're slightly deleterious. They're not damaging enough to where selection can see them. And so they're largely invisible. They're subject to genetic drift. They build up in populations and they degenerate, essentially. The typical atheist response, and I'm wondering what you believe would be a good counter, is, well, okay, at first they're nearly neutral, but once they build up enough in a population, the damage becomes so overwhelming that now at this point, selection can see the load and remove the load from the equation. And in turn, they'll say that helps the species. What do you believe would be a good counter to that?
Well, that's a creative story, but it's like saying, well, I spend too much money compared to what I make. I keep spending more and more money, and eventually, I'll end up with more money.
Eventually, I'll be
If
rich.
you spend more money, eventually you're going to end up broke. And same with mutations. Mistakes add up, and it's really not even that creative. I guess they're trying to come up with a reason to justify their worldview. But when I worked at the medical school, I'm sure if I would have mentioned that, they would have looked at me like, "Are you feeling okay? You want an aspirin? It's kind of warm in here. You're spending too much time in the dark room, or what's going on here?" We had to develop the pictures with TMI, transmission electron microscopy. We had a photograph. We had an older equipment. We had a photograph of what we were looking at, and then develop them. So I spent a lot of time in the dark room.
So, yeah, I think it's, well, firstly, it's a rescue device. It's a weak rescue device. And it kind of misses the point. And correct if I'm wrong, Jerry, genetic degeneration, this reality of mutation accumulation, it basically puts forth the idea that we are all multiply mutant. Every single person on this planet has mutations that they've inherited from their parents and grandparents. And so genetic entropy is basically the fact that every generation is a little more mutant than the previous generation. So if everybody's mutant, apparently these mutations are going to build up to where selection can see them. Well, when that happens, the damage is population wide. And so what's the result of that? Extinction? How is that ever going to solve the problem? How is that ever going to promote large scale evolution? Does that make sense?
Well,
Jared?
what you're talking about, that is one good evidence for natural selection, because natural selection consistently selects out those who build up mutation to a certain level or certain kinds of mutation. And therefore, natural selection reduces degeneration of the race. Therefore, it does have a function, very important function. It doesn't improve it. It just reduces the degeneration of the race, of the organism.
Right. And their next follow-up, Jerry, there's kind of two main arguments. Their next big one, and you and I, we did a whole show on mutations, and you addressed this very comprehensively, but they'll say, well, beneficial mutations, although rare, when they do occur and accumulate, they can counterbalance the damage. So yes, we have this high influx of nearly neutral mutations every generation, as you've explained, Jerry, in your presentation. And they'll say, but the beneficial mutations that manifest from time to time, they'll be beneficial enough to counterbalance the damage. What would be a good response to that?
Well, I'd like to see an example of that. I'd like to see how they can come to that conclusion. There are, of course, beneficial mutations, but typically it's because one gene breaks, doesn't work anymore, and other genes are able to take care of that function. A good example would be colors. If you have several genes for eye color, for example, and the brown one is broken, doesn't work anymore, then the other gene for the blue pigment will work, and you can see then the result of the mutation. But whether you call that beneficial, I don't know.
Right. And yes. And you've pointed out, Jerry, that the majority of your so-called beneficial mutations are at the genotype reductive. They're functionally compromising to organisms. So sure, you might have a beneficial phenotypic effect. Let's say with sickle cell anemia, you're now resistant to malaria. Okay. But at the genotype, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the result of a broken protein, broken cell, a deformed hemoglobin protein. So overall, it's reductive, is it not?
Right.
So,
Good
so
point.
how could reductive mutations ever counterbalance the damage? I guess we should probably ask the evolutionists.
Well, of course they can't. Most of the examples of beneficial mutations are beneficial not for the organism, but for us. Good example would be seedless fruit, seedless watermelon. That's a mutation which the watermelon cannot produce the normal level of seeds. And it's beneficial for us, but obviously not for the watermelon or for the oranges or other plants. And so if you look up beneficial mutation in any search engine, especially the genomic base, which has a lot of the articles on genes, you can find that there are some beneficial mutations out there, but they rarely, I'm not aware of a single one that adds information. Basically, they produce beneficial effects at one time or another for one reason or another, but you're not producing new genes or new structures. You're basically changing old structures, which in some situations can be beneficial.
Are you familiar with the example that's commonly put forth in certain bacteria? It's the myelinase so-called beneficial mutation. They'll say, well, bacteria have evolved the ability to digest nylon, and so that's new information. Are you familiar with that one? And do you believe it's
I wouldn't say that's new information. I would say it has a ability to break down nylon or ability to respond in other ways. But basically, we have a gene which produces an enzyme which breaks something down, and sometimes changes in that gene can cause the enzyme to be able to break down other things. And so I would say it could be built in so that we have a system where if a bacteria is exposed to some other unique nutrient, they can utilize that nutrient when certain genes occur. But we're not talking about evolving into a better, more evolved bacteria. We're talking about a change that can occur, which allows the bacteria to thrive in another environment.
right? I think that's a great response. So it sounds like you're saying that the pre-existing ability to digest this synthetic material is in the bacteria to begin with.
Right.
Okay. And even if, for sake of argument, let's just say there was one or two truly beneficial mutations that weren't reductive or functionally compromising to organisms, that's not going to be enough to counterbalance the damage. I mean, you'd need hundreds to thousands of truly beneficial mutations. Is that right, Dr.
That's
Bergman?
a good point. When you talk about 1 or 2 or even 100 beneficial mutations, that's interesting. But on the other hand, you need, as you said, enormous number of mutations to change an organism from one type to another, or even change one structure to another structural design. You need a huge number of mutations, and they have to be the right set in the right place at the right time.
Right. I think that's a great point. So we do have, as usual, several skeptics in the chat, and we do appreciate our skeptic friends. That's why we do these live. We hope to plant seeds and address challenges. And so Gutsa Gibbon, she is a popular evolutionist YouTuber, and we're actually going to be responding to one of her videos very shortly here. And so she says, and she's a teacher, she says, Bergman and Donny are misunderstanding a topic, so we're happy to engage the criticism that she just taught to her students. She's saying what is beneficial is context specific. So for example, the sickle cell anemia, it's beneficial for those who might be in an environment where they could get malaria. Okay, well, firstly, sickle cell anemia is bad. That's a bad disease. We don't want that. And malaria is also a horrible disease. So either way, it's bad. But the point we're trying to make, and feel free to respond to this, Dr. Bergman, is that when you actually look at the genotype or under the hood, like I like to say, these, although context specific, are damaging. It's due to something broken, a pre-existing system that's breaking. Jerry, can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's true that they are context specific, that whether they're beneficial depends upon the context or the environment. That's true. That's not. And in dealing with cancer, you realize that they eventually cause the death of the organism. And so you might have some beneficial mutations that in some situations may be helpful in some areas, but by and large, the vast majority are in the long run negative and cause damage to the genome, causing damage to the organism, causing cancer. And we know especially a lot about this because, well, not only cancer, but many diseases are a result of mutations, cancer especially. And I guess you could probably find, if you looked at some of the mutations that are involved in cancer, we know many, P53, P13, P12, there's quite a large number of mutations we're aware of. Now, if you look at those, there may be in some situations where it is beneficial, but in the long run, as the mutations accumulate, they're always negative, and that is why cancer eventually, unless it can be cured by killing the genes that cause the problem, unless it can be cured, it's always lethal. And that's the goal, of course, of treating cancer, is to destroy the genes, destroy the cells that, and ideally genes if you can, but almost always the cells.
I think that's a great point. And one illustration I like to make that I've never seen a good response from the evolutionists in terms of this context specific argument and the nature of beneficial mutations is, if I temporarily wanted better gas mileage in my car, I could remove weight off the car. I can start destroying the car. Essentially, I can remove the seats, remove the, side windows, and basically just make the car a lot lighter. And so temporarily I'd get better gas mileage, but overall I'm destroying the car. And
Right.
so there's like a narrow benefit, you could say, but in terms of total functionality of the car, it's not telling us how we built the car, and it's not really making the car any better, is it, Jerry?
No, it isn't.
Yeah, and so that's the way I see it, because she says this boils down to redefining fitness. I don't think it's necessarily redefining fitness. I think it's just common sense that, yeah, we might have some narrow increases in fitness in some of these cases of beneficial mutations, Jerry, but overall it's reductive to total functionality of these organisms. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, that's true. And even in the cancer, the genes that cause cancer, there may be some beneficial effect to some of the changes that are made. But by and large, when you have some that occur, you have others, and then that beneficial effect will be wiped out very quickly.
Right, I agree. And so she follows up here with a fair point, and so we'll have you engage it, Jerry. And so her assertion is all mutations are the result of an error in DNA replication. It's like a typographical error in a text, or protein synthesis. And I like to define a mutation as basically an alteration in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. So she says these errors are beneficial in many contexts, but we would point out that in those, even in those beneficial mutations, typically they're reductive. And then she says, and can even create brand new proteins. Jerry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's possible you can get some new proteins or certainly change the structure of it. But again, hotspots is a major issue. Not only hotspots, but you have a number of reasons why the vast majority of mutations are problematic. And these are words she's stating. I'd like to see, and you may even get one case where this is shown to be true, but we don't need one case, we need thousands of cases in order to produce a new organism. And again, the negative mutations, the deleterious, are going to swamp the organism eventually, and it's going to die. Although it's interesting, you do get some people, George Burns is the best example, who smoked cigars all his life. I guess one cigar is about equal to a pack of cigarettes. Smoked cigars all his life, lived to be 99, and died because he fell in the bathtub.
Wow.
Some people, it seems they're just, and evidently the problem is, or not, the situation is where their body is so effective in repairing the genes that are damaged that they can abuse their body and live to be quite like George Burns, 99, although I'm not sure how many examples there are like George Burns, but it said if you live to be like 75 or 80, you probably live to be 95. And I noticed in looking at the obituaries, a lot of people die in their 70s.
Yes.
And then you seem to have people who die in their 70s, and then a lot of people die in their 90s. And you certainly have some die in their 80s, but there seems to be, if you make it so far, you'll make it 10 or 20 years farther. And how common that is, I don't know, but it's something that's been observed.
Are you familiar with the example? Because she puts forth what she thinks is the best, or one of the best examples. She says, my go-to new protein is the antifreeze in cold water cod and in ice fish. So just on the spot, from my understanding of that, basically of these fish in cold water, and it's argued or asserted that they evolved these new antifreeze proteins that basically gave them the ability to now survive in this cold water. And I think they say, yeah, it's due to a new protein. But I think they're inferring that from the past. I don't think they observed this in real time. They just see this effect that the fish are having. And so they propose duplications followed by neo-functionalization, and therefore a new protein. What would be a good response to that, Jerry?
Yeah, I'm aware of that. It's just need to. Yeah, one situation I studied a few years ago, but I have to look at my notes to be able to remind specifically what happened. But yeah, there are cases like this. That's not the, but you need more than a few cases.
Right, like
cases don't really say much. A
And
dollar
this
doesn't buy you a home. It takes a lot more to get the whole house.
Exactly.
$2 isn't going to do it.
You can give them a few. You can give them 100, like we were saying. I think the fact that there's a few that we could sit here and argue about all day is actually testimony to how weak evolutionary theory is, because there should just be no question. There should be hundreds and hundreds that they could present. I would even argue that this example, because there's another one, notothenioid antifreeze Arctic fish, I believe it is, where there has been some work done that suggests this could be epigenetics, where basically they have these pre-existing genes that are turned on when they enter these environments, because we know environments can result in these kinds of changes, and those genes are already present. They're just turned on, and now they can adapt rapidly.
Yeah, and to me, they use a few examples which may be valid, but from these few examples, they're trying to prove a very broad generalization, which is evolution. And to me, it's like saying, well, we've got an influx in our town of people from Spain, and the 25 people in our town from Spain, one has committed a robbery, another one has committed a rape, another one has committed some other crime. Therefore, obviously, people from Spain are criminals, and they should be locked up because look at we only have 12 in our town, and yet we have 3 major crimes committed by these 12, by these 3, whatever. And so therefore, you're trying to generalize to the entire population. And of course, you can't do that. And we've done that with tragic results in the past when we generalize from blacks end up, black males, young black males, get in trouble, and we generalize that to the whole population. And that's commonly done, and yet there's a problem. Hitler, the same thing with Jews. He had a few examples which proved his thesis, and obviously these few examples were only a few examples, but he generalized that to the entire population.
Those are some good points, Jerry. You mentioned hotspots, mutational hotspots. Do you believe as time goes on, we're going to find that there are many more hotspots than those in the evolutionary community would admit? Because a lot of the evolutionists, when I argue with them, including PhDs, they'll say, well, these hotspots are probabilistic. There's not as many as you creationists are saying, rather than the hotspots or the mutations occurring in a deterministic fashion. Jerry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true. The only reason you'd look for hotspots would be in a mutation that has caused a problem. And so therefore you evaluate them for hotspots. And the fact is, though, we only look at primarily mutations which cause disease, etc., unless we're concerned about some other issue like pigmentation or something else. But on the other hand, my supposition is if we looked at 1 million genes that mutated, we would find in the vast majority hotspots. Now, I can't prove that, but the fact is we found so many hotspots. And if you look up in any index of genetic evaluations, you find that there are many we know of. I'm not sure if anybody has looked for how common they are, but from my experience, the ones I'm aware of, they're quite common.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. Okay, Jerry, I have 2 clips I want to interact with. And so I'm going to present my screen. We'll watch these short clips, interact with them. So you mentioned Richard Dawkins. So we have one here from Guts at Gibbon on Neanderthals. We'll do that one second. First one is, and I thought this was a very entertaining interview. It was actually more of a debate. So you mentioned Richard Dawkins and your conversion from near atheism. You, if I heard you correctly, you weren't 100% an atheist, but very close to it. And so you converted to Christianity. And so this just happened 8 days ago, Piers Morgan, and he challenged Richard Dawkins on his atheism, Piers Morgan being a theist. And so I just wanted to play a quick excerpt from here and get your response to Richard Dawkins on the origin of the universe. I think it's kind of incredible what he says, and I'd love to get your feedback, Jerry.
Okay.
So I'm going to mute my mic and we're going to listen just for a minute.
I brought that up again as being the flaw in your position, which is what is there before it starts? What is nothing?
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist, but what I would answer to Professor Meyer is that we need to explain complexity in terms of simplicity. And of course, it's true that I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang. Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was, it's
but it
got to be
has to,
simple.
doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke.
Doesn't it have to? I mean,
I didn't hear that.
someone as logical as you are, I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
A physicist will tell you that
Yeah, but what do you tell me?
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say first of all. They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang.
Jerry, let's stop it there. So I find that incredible, his response, that he appeals to physicists. And he says, well, physicists would say that saying before is inaccurate. You can't say before the Big Bang because there was nothing. And oftentimes they'll look to quantum mechanics or quantum physics on the nothing. So I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts to Richard Dawkins, his response there to Piers Morgan, pressing him on the question, what was before the Big Bang?
Yeah, that's a number of cosmologists have pointed out the same thing. And when you read books on astronomy and cosmology, of course, you get the same discussion. What they say is that before, if you can use that word, before the Big Bang, there was nothing, no time, no space, no matter, no energy. Okay, fine. And how did all those things come into existence? Well, we don't know how. We're still working on that. But we know that before the Big Bang, there was no time, space, matter, or energy. So the explanation is it just happened. It's magic. It's just happened. Creationists accept the same thing. Before the creation, there was no time, space, or matter. The only difference is we say the beginning was God. God created time, space, matter, and energy. They say the beginning was, we don't know, or nothing. It's the ultimate free lunch, the ultimate creation of time, space, matter, and energy. The ultimate free lunch, we don't know for sure why, but we know it happened. And creationists have an explanation where they don't. So basically you have two worldviews. One is God created. The other is nothing created. And so either God or nothing, that's the choice we have. And so creationists accept God brought all these things into existence. The evolutionists would say they just popped into existence. And some will use that term, it popped into existence. Big Bang in many ways is what popped into existence. And a number of cosmologists, of course, have speculated on this. But to me, it's intriguing that they've come to the point where at one time there was literally nothing. And therefore, as Genesis says, the beginning was, nothing, and then nothing, and then there was disorder, and so on. And so therefore, it's a good illustration of either nothing created everything or God created everything. But yeah, he realized you couldn't, you say you can't use the term like before. Well, that's, what rule is that? Where do you get that from?
Yeah. A rule made up by atheist physicists. And so, yeah, I think you make some good points there. And doesn't the data demand a creator? Because you have the first law of thermodynamics, correct me if I'm wrong, matter and energy can't be created nor destroyed. But then your second law is the law of increasing entropy, the fact that everything is winding down. Okay, if we were to wind it back up to a point of least increasing entropy, if that's an accurate way to say it, but then matter and energy can't be created nor destroyed, then that means matter and energy must have come into existence from an outside force.
Right.
So it really is the atheist that has the major challenge here, isn't it?
Yeah, the atheists call that the uncaused first cause. But again, it's nothing create everything doesn't make sense. That's violation, of course, of the law of entropy, which you mentioned. That matter can be neither created nor destroyed, only changed in form.
Yeah, so it must have come into existence from an outside force. The universe can't be eternal. Matter can't be eternal because of the second law. But then the first law demands an outside force. And like you said, brother, great point. Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. There's time, matter, and space. And so if I were to continue, I watched the whole debate, so I know what he's going to say next. So Richard Dawkins says, basically, he doesn't know. So they're still working on that. They get into the origin of life. He basically admits as a biologist that they're working on that. Just, they're doing a lot of work on this, right? Rather than admit God. So Richard Dawkins ends up saying, well, to Pierce Morgan, he says, well, God's not a good answer because God is too complex. He says, we need an explanation that's simple. What are your thoughts on that? So basically, no, God's too complex. We need a simple explanation for the origin of the universe, because basically if we propose a complex answer to that, it just raises more questions, Richard says.
Yeah, to me, the whole problem is they've got these evolution glasses on and they see the world, they distort the world because of those evolution glasses. And if you take the glasses off, you look at the world the way it is. And he doesn't want to do that. He constantly distorts the world because of those glasses. Well, at least occasionally, take the glasses off and look at the world the way it is. And if you look at the world the way it actually is, you will see something very different, like I mentioned, relative to dogs. If you ask him, why are dogs the way they are? Why are they such incredibly good companions? Why is there over 1 billion people in the world, everywhere throughout the entire world, that have dogs? There's no civilization of any merit that did not have dogs as part of their culture, part of their world. So why is that? Well, that's just it evolved that way. That's the way we tamed dogs. They were wild dogs. All dogs were wild at first, and we slowly domesticated them.
Right.
That's what they say. So.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, we never went without a dog. Always.
What?
As we were growing up in our household, we always had a dog.
Yeah.
It was one dog after another. They were family. So, Jerry, I appreciate those points. And so, okay, I mean, we could have some fun with that video all day, but I want to move on to the next for sake of time. And so here's the next one. I'm going to present screen and we'll listen to this for a minute. It's actually in a way, a direct response to a video you and I did together, Dr. Bergman. And so this is Gutsick Gibbon. She is in the chat. She has a popular YouTube channel where she challenges young earth creation and those who would reject evolution. So she has a video here titled Neanderthals Make Young Earth Creationism Impossible. And so in many ways, I do appreciate our skeptics and critics that are willing to engage with us and to interact with the topic of origins in general, because it is an important topic, Jerry. So I just want to play this for a minute or so and then get your thoughts. on what she's saying here. So we'll start it right now.
The differences in these two crania, right, in the two skulls, in the way that I teach my students, in the way that I think is most memorable. Neanderthals have a prominent brow ridge, a large nasal aperture, tapered orbits, swept back zygomatics, and the presence of an occipital bun in combination with a very unique cranial vault shape that is platycephalic, like low and long, and a non-vaulted forehead. So you can combine all of those things together and say those are Neanderthal autapomorphies. I often see creationists will point to living people, like with a big brow ridge or something like that, and they'll say, see, that looks like a Neanderthal. That guy looks like he could be a Neanderthal. Therefore, the morphology that defines Neanderthals is not sufficient. They're not a sufficient suite to distinguish them.
I mean, we could point to, and you have pointed to in previous presentations here, to actors, boxers. There's one specific Russian boxer, Nikolai, I think his name is, where they have that distinct Neanderthal trait in the brow ridge. So modern day people have Neanderthal traits.
But I'm really sorry. A brow ridge is one characteristic of dozens of autapomorphies, and I'm only listing a few here. There is not a human alive that has more than 5, I would say. It's a ballpark swing, and I bet most of them are minute. There's not a human alive that has the combination that I just mentioned going over this now. And if I'm wrong on that, all you got to do is show me the skull. So let's move on to the next.
Okay, so let's stop it there to summarize or reiterate her points. Dr. Bergman. Basically, she's arguing it's not 1, 2, or even 5 of these specific traits she's pointing to. Occipital bun, the brow ridges. We've discussed those unique features of Neanderthals. It's the fact that there's dozens, and we don't find any extant humans today with that suite of traits that you find in Neanderthals or other robust humans. And so Neanderthals couldn't have descended from Adam and Eve. They must be a sister species. They're too morphologically different for us young earth creationists to explain. And so I was wondering your thoughts on that, because you did just put out an article that I thought was excellent on Neanderthals. You titled it Neanderthals Are Us, August 21st, 2024. We can talk about that in a second, a little bit. Jerry, I'd be wondering what a good response is to what she's saying.
Well, the fact is we can interbreed with Neanderthals, and therefore, as we have done so, probably we had several different groups we interbred with, and that may be why there's so much variety we find in human beings today. Many of us, including me, I had my DNA done by 23andMe, and they found I was 5% Neanderthal. And so many people from my area where I was from, Eastern Europe, have Neanderthal traits. And so if you had 10,000 Neanderthals, not the skull that she had, which was obviously broken in many pieces and they had to put it together, if you had a dozen or 1,000 Neanderthals, then you could get some average traits. But my guess is you would find there's a variety of traits among that 1,000 as there is among humans. And so why she says that all Neanderthals, I don't think she's even saying this, but she's implying all Neanderthals have all of these, 16 traits she stated or more. So to me, that's presumptuous that you can say that, because we don't know that. Unless, now I know we have a lot of Neanderthal bones and we managed to assemble them. But that's and the assembly takes a lot of skill, and also we have very few total. In fact, I don't think we have a single total Neanderthal skeleton, not one. We have made one out of many other different skeletons. And so we produced one, but it has probably 30 different sources for the bones they used to produce this one.
I think it is profound that we do have their genetics. We have Neanderthal genes and DNA. And so that would tell us that we interbred with them, reproduce with them, we had kids, progeny. And so I've heard many paleoanthropologists in the conventional sense, non-young earth creationists, say Neanderthals are us, just adapted to a cold ecoglacial environment. That's what they've said, not non-creationists. And so with Erica's video, I made a couple notes, and I also discussed or consulted Dr. Peter Line as well, who has a lot of knowledge on this, and you've written a book with. And so what I noted is that she, in her video, makes plenty of assumptions. So if people watch the whole video, you'll find some presumptions there that the cranial morphology of Adam and Eve looked like average modern humans of today. And so I would argue, Dr. Jerry, that the reality is we simply don't know what Adam and Eve look like, nor do we know what Noah and his family look like. And so if the Bible's account of ancient people is true, that's our starting point, and they lived for hundreds of years, then there had to have been something different about them. We know they lived in different environments, and we know that environment, due to epigenetics for many reasons, has profound effects on morphology. So I think, and I wonder if you would agree, it's kind of making an assumption that extant humans today morphologically looked exactly like pre-flood or even immediate post-flood humans.
A lot of assumptions there, and I agree with you. She's making an awful lot of assumptions, and she has a pair of thick evolution glasses, and she just can't see the world the way it is. She doesn't want to see the world the way it is. I'm not sure why she's so anxious to prove evolution, but she is. Take care of my cough here.
No worries. Take your time, Jay. I appreciate you doing this. Yeah, because if Noah and his family were morphologically heterogeneous, let's say, or just diverse, a lot more diverse, then the features that we see that she points to, these specific traits, even the dozens of them that we see in robust humans, okay, those plus the traits that make modern extant humans unique can be explained. I mean, we have this dispersal event at Babel. We would see different groups of people basically taking subsets of that pre-existing variation, both genetic and morphological. They would take those into different parts of the globe where they would then become isolated and become a little more prominent. And so I think those features can certainly be explained. And so, Jerry, on that note, I want to show your article here. Neanderthals are us. So this is up to date, and you point out research shows that one formerly leading missing link is now a recent member of the human family, and this is based on a relatively new secular paper, from my understanding. And so, Jerry, can you give us the importance of your findings here and what you wrote about Neanderthals?
Well, Neanderthals was one of the chief proofs of evolution for probably a century or more. And this was in all the textbooks. It was taught in the schools for generations. And now we know that these claims are totally wrong. We're talking about simply another people group, which in every way is human, some facial differences, some probably other differences. But on the other hand, we're talking about a huge mistake they made. A racist mistake, which we recognize now, that was made by the evolutionists. One of my main interests is that so many of the ideas that evolutionists propounded the past century are wrong, totally wrong. Not only wrong, but embarrassingly wrong. And this is just one of many examples where they're just as well recognized, they're just us.
Right. And I put out a video, and I took an excerpt from a lecture. I think it was in 2022 now. And it was a respected paleo anthropologist. And he concluded Neanderthals are not a different species. Neanderthals are us, just adapted to a cold ecoglacial system. So it sounds like there's ongoing debate and controversy within the conventional paleoanthropological community, where we as creationists, we can say, yeah, we don't have a problem with that. We have their genes. We interbred with them. They're certainly human, but morphologically distinct for many reasons. And so I appreciate your article here, Jerry. Another one that you wrote and was published in the Answers Research Journal. Great work. mollusk shell, not the product of time and chance, but of design. So I've got it up here for people to see. Here's your abstract. Here's the technical paper in its entirety. So can you briefly touch on the importance of this technical article and in your findings dealing with mollusk shells?
Well, one advantage we have is that there are no shortage of shells in the world, mollusk shells. There are probably billions in museums, in collections that people have in their houses. And if we went out to any seashore, we could probably find a couple hundred if we looked in the right places. So we're talking about a huge sample. And yet we have zero evidence for the evolution of the shell. And certainly if it did evolve, we would have plenty of evidence for it. But the evidence is from the oldest to the youngest. They all design pretty much the same way. We get a lot of variety in them, but by and large, there's no evidence whatsoever that they evolved from a non-shell to a shell. And if they evolved from a non-shell, there must be some evidence in the fossil record for this non-shell design, and then slowly becoming a shell design. And the evidence isn't there. And this is a good example because we're all familiar with shells, with seashells of various types. And there are collectors. In fact, I relied upon several mammoth books. There are collectors who have millions of examples, and they admit there's no evidence for their evolution. No matter how old they are, how young they are, they're pretty much the same. Again, a lot of variety, that we don't deny that. But on the other hand, there's no evidence of evolution. Much evidence of evolution is problematic because soft tissue. But shells are not soft tissue. Shells are pretty substantial design, which if buried can last for enormous number of years. And so therefore, it's a good example of evolution couldn't be true. One of many.
Right. So is that a strong example of irreducible complexity then, where that shell basically had to be created more or less as is, fully functioning, fully working?
I would say, of course, because the organism can't survive without the shell. It has to have the shell to survive. And therefore, since that's true, you don't see any non-shelled, pre-shell, shell-developing organism because, well, it's not going to work. It's not going to survive. It's not going to be alive. So to be alive, to survive, have to have a complete shell. And that's what we see in the fossil record. And that's what we see in Genesis. That's what Genesis tells us.
So in your work into the writing of this technical paper, do you find the evolutionary scientists just basically admitting that they're working on it? They hope to find the evolutionary history of these shells. How are they responding exactly?
Oh, they often say, yeah, we're working on it. And many of those say it's just, there's no answer. We don't understand. There's no evolution. There's no evidence of evolution of these shells. And therefore, we're baffled. I have a feeling a lot of these people are creationists. They may not say this. They may not say this in the article. But sometimes when you read these books about mollusks, in this case, they really seem to be creationists. They don't openly state that, but it's there.
Right. You know, I experience this a lot with the other side, with proponents of evolution. They'll say, especially when I put forth a significant paper that has pretty clear implications for creation, as you know, they'll say, oh, but the authors of these papers, they're not young earth creationists. They haven't rejected evolution. So you can't use that paper to put forth a position that is anti-evolution. Jerry, what are your thoughts on when an evolutionist says that?
I would say certainly many of these realize if they come out of the closet and become a creationist or admit they are, it's going to affect their professional career. And so I would say many are creationists, but all their work, the view that they display is an evolutionary worldview because they have to, they know to survive. And I would say it's pretty hard to be an evolutionist and not realize there's going to be a problem if you are a creationist in that world.
The way I see it, and great points, good scientific investigation and critical thinking skills tells us that we read these papers, we look at the data, we look at that which is empirical, but we're not just going to blindly believe the conclusions of these authors. Obviously, a lot of them have their evolutionary glasses on as they're interpreting this data. They've got their basic presuppositions and worldview. And like you said, they can't just come right out in these papers and say, well, looks like evolution's false. Would that paper even be published, Jerry?
I would think it would be difficult to publish that. And I would think most know it. Most probably know our friends who were out of the closet creationists and had their career ended. And so I think you'd have to be naive not to realize that this is a career ender to come out of the closet. And a lot of them, I've talked to some of these people, and they say there's no reason. There's no reason for me to state, well, I have a creation worldview, or I'm a creationist. I'm doing science. I'm doing well. I'm paying my bills. There's no reason. I have no need to come out. I can do my research. I can publish my books with no problem. But when you read some of the stuff, though, you can see their creation worldview is there, but very hidden, very behind the scenes.
Right.
They're not very open. And so, yeah, I would say sometimes I'm told when people get to know these people real well, you can see they don't accept the evolutionary worldview, but they don't want to affect their career or their family or their promotion either. So you can see they go along with the crowd because they realize they have to survive. It's not worth it to come out. What point would there be in me coming out of the closet? There would be no point. It would alienate my friends, possibly my family in some cases, my colleagues, etc., and my career. So there's no need to come out. And a lot just don't want to come out. Why come out? This is what I am. This is what I believe, but there's no point in affecting anything else.
Excellent points. It reminds me of two creationists. Dr. Rob Carter, he published a paper in the conventional literature, past peer review, on the Eve consensus sequence. He worked on it behind the scenes with Dr. John Sanford, another young earth creationist. He's the author of Genetic Entropy. And this paper was incredible. I mean, it gave us the Eve consensus sequence in mitochondrial DNA. It showed that everybody on the planet has very low variation in their mitochondrial DNA, and that mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to a single woman. But because it's in the conventional literature, they couldn't really come right out and say, well, this demonstrates biblical creation, this refutes evolution. But when you look at the data and really read in between the lines, there's no other conclusion that you can make other than, yeah, every single person today has descended from a single woman just thousands of years ago.
Yeah, that's true.
And have a look at this, Jerry, because you recently wrote a technical article. And I love when I see one of your new articles come out, brother. I really look forward to reading those because you put a lot of work. You put a lot of work, time, energy, and effort into these. And so I do recommend people check these out. So here's a new paper, 2024, on the ape sex chromosomes. So the X and the Y. And just truly incredible here that confirms the created kind model. So I recommend people take the time to go through this visual. I think you'll really like this, Jerry. And so here's the chromosome alignability and divergence. And so if you go down here and take humans, for example. So here's human in the Y chromosome, 100% obviously human to human. Look at human, look at human to chimpanzee. I mean, maybe I can zoom in. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, here we go. So human to chimpanzee, similarity in the Y chromosome, 26.2%.
Oh,
I don't know about you, but that is a massive difference. A massive difference. And that screams separate ancestry. If you take the gorilla down here, Jerry, so here's gorilla to gorilla, 100% as expected. Gorilla to human, 23.2%. The most similar, and I would argue it's because they're related, are the orangutans. So they're very similar here. I would say they go back to their own created kind on the ark. Bonobo and chimpanzee, they're very similar. Right here, very high degree of similarity, especially compared to gorilla and chimpanzee in humans. And so to here, I think we have a very elegant explanation where we've got humans as their own kind, chimpanzees and bonobos going back to their own kind, gorillas being unique, their own kind, and then your orangutans. And this all confirmed from this data in the conventional literature. Dr. Bergman, what are your thoughts on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I see this over and over. This is why I'm thinking about the projects I've published in the past. I'm close to 2,000 publications. And I'm really wondering, I will have plenty in my foreseeable lifetime. And I just did one on penguins, and same issues come up over and over again.
Yeah.
And indeed, there's no evidence for evolution. It cannot have evolved. And I just find this rewarding because no matter what subject I take, I find evidence for the creation worldview and evidence against the evolutionary worldview. And so it's very rewarding. It doesn't matter. I can't imagine a single topic I will take, at least that hasn't been the past, where I find there's good evidence for Darwinian evolution. It's not there. Okay, there you go, penguins. That just came up today.
Yeah. So you've been working hard, Jerry. You just published this today, so I haven't had a chance to look it over yet because here we are together. So you say a new 2024 fossil analysis fails to show that penguin flippers evolved from flight wings. Wow. So, you know, it's a great time to be a biblical creationist because 2024, and we're getting more and more data right from the conventional literature, powerfully challenging evolution. If you don't mind, could you give us a brief summary why this is important to evidence for creation?
Well, they claimed it was evidence for evolution of the wing from a bird wing to a pigeon flipper, basically. And just wasn't there. And they're reading beyond what they found and trying to imply they found evidence, but the evidence wasn't there. It was clearly a well-designed flipper. And of course, one problem with this concern is that the bones they used to do the evaluations were very fragments. You don't find any of these ancient penguins that are really bones are in perfect condition. They're fragments at best. And this was a particular type of pigeon that lived in very cold climates. The Arctic, they call them the Arctic pigeons. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 or 3 they discovered. And
so would we, from the creationist model, would we argue that penguins today, which seem to be adapted to their cold environments, they've descended from a penguin-like creature off of the ark that simply had the pre-existing traits to eventually adapt?
Yeah, that's pretty obvious then. What the traits are, they're short and fat.
Yeah.
Retains energy. Tall and thin, you lose heat. And so short and fat, you lose far less heat. So their by design is such where they can survive in these cold areas. Very cold areas.
Well, it kind of goes back to, because we had Gutsy Gibbon respond in the chat and say Neanderthals were not heterozygous. I understand that. They were highly inbred. They had a lot of recessive mutations. But going back to Noah and his family and those 3 reproducing couples, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their 3 wives, we've all descended from them. So as people move out, spread out to different parts, and other people get stuck in these cold ecoglacial environments, a lot of the pre-existing ability to adapt is now manifested. And so a lot of these traits are there pre-existing. Does that make sense, Jerry?
Some of these could be beneficial mutations, or at least not harmful mutations. There's no doubt that you're going to get some mutations that produce variety, which is not really beneficial, but it's not harmful. But it does produce variety, colors, designs of certain structures. So can't rule out all beneficial mutations. There are some. But then again, we're not in my field. We're not going to look at mutations that cause a slight change in color. We're focusing on mutations that cause cancer. And that's
right.
true of most cancer researchers. That's what we're focusing on.
Well, you can look in the journals, you can just Google, harmful mutations. You're going to come up with thousands and thousands of disease causing mutations, and you'll rarely come up with a mutation that's actually beneficial. It's just largely understood that mutations are bad. Mutations are harmful. They lead to cancer, like you're saying. This isn't going to take a fish to fisherman. Gutsy Gibbons says this, and it's a fair point. I'd be curious as to what you think. I definitely have my thoughts. She says there will always be controversy, because we were talking about how a lot of what occurs in paleoanthropology is contested on what belongs in the same species, because species are static concepts applied to a dynamic process. But isn't it the evolutionist that struggles with that? Because from my understanding, Jerry, you have lumpers and splitters. But we understand as creationists that there exists a lot of variation in kinds. Like today, there oftentimes exists more variation between species than within species, like with dogs. And so, yeah, we can say these aren't different species. These are just, this is the potential of variation. And a line of evidence, like you pointed to, was the fact that we can interbreed, which tells that it's the same kind.
Yeah.
And so, Jerry, what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting, the variation. There are animals that have huge amounts of variation, and they are horses, dogs, and cats. Most animals have variation, but not nearly as much as you see in horses, cats, and dogs. And so I think horses, cats, and dogs were designed to have variation so that they are useful for us for specific reasons. So we have small dogs, we have large dogs, we have horses about the size of a German Shepherd, we have horses that are like 8 feet tall. And so we have variety in horses, I think, because that's what they were created to have, variety, so they could serve our needs, the needs of humans.
Do you think it's a problem for us creationists that there oftentimes exists more diversity between species that we would say are related, like lions, tigers, domestic cats, jaguars? There exists more diversity in those felid species, but some creationists, and I'm not opposed to it, would say that all of those felid species do go back to a common archetype. But then humans and chimps, apparently, according to the evolutionists, have fewer DNA differences, but we wouldn't say they're related. Is there a contradiction there for us creationists, do you think?
Well, not really. The cats that do have a huge amount of variation, that's true. And I think it's the cat family is, I agree, that probably always from one pair of cats. And from that one pair, we have house cats and lions and tigers, etc. Hard, without careful evaluation, of course, it's hard to make that generalization, but that appears to be the case, judging by those people who have looked in this issue and looked at genetic variation. So that's true. On the other hand, so many animals, though, have little genetic variation, relatively very little genetic variation. In fact, most animals have very little genetic variation. They're pretty much the same. And endeavoring to produce more variation, we have reached limits very quickly.
And if we go back to the Genesis starting point, I think there's something here. God creates two people, Adam and Eve. So right off the bat, that restricts genetic diversity. But God creates, in terms of a lot of these animals like cats, dogs, so on and so forth, he creates them in bulk, in populations. Maybe there's thousands to millions initially at creation in these fully working and functioning ecosystems. And so right off the bat, it seems like a lot of these creatures, take cats or dogs, they're going to start off with a lot more diversity and the potential to diversify than humans.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's almost not even apples to apples if we were to compare humans to, let's say, cats, or humans to chimps. A lot of these animals, they would have, it seems, a greater ability to diversify. And speaking of dogs, there we go, brother.
Yeah, there's my dog. He wants to go for a walk.
Yeah, well, you know what? That's a great point, and I think a great time for us to start wrapping things up. I really appreciate this. I had a lot of fun, Jerry. We covered a lot of ground because I had a lot we wanted to cover, but yet we basically got to cover it all. We got to cover your newest articles. your newest technical paper. We got to respond to the Neanderthal video and also the Richard Dawkins exchange with Pierce Morgan. So, Jerry, excellent. Go ahead, brother.
I could mention we have the county fair now, which is a block from me. And I was there yesterday, and I'm interested in this variation question. And I talked to the people about rabbits, chickens, etc. And they mentioned there's not much variation at all. Some, of course.
Oh, wow.
Specifically with rabbits, there's some, but relatively little compared to cats, dogs, and horses. And so they're in this business. This is the people who are raising rabbits. They're looking for variation. They're looking to breed certain traits in the rabbits, and they find you come to the limit very quickly in breeding, not only with rabbits, but with cows and many other animals. Again, there's variation, but not nearly the variation we see in dogs, cats, and horses.
So with a lot of these animals that you would breed, like rabbits, they eventually hit walls where they don't really have much more allelic variability left to vary anymore.
Yeah, we don't. And of course, that's what we're trying to do is breed a rabbit with different traits. And they get, there's some variation, but again, it's quite limited. And when you walk around and look at all the hundreds of rabbits they have, they all look pretty much the same.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the evolutionists would require you go back in time. They would essentially have to have the contraction of genetic information and over time the expansion. But we seem to see the opposite. We see the creation model where we're losing information, we're losing variability over time as creatures go out and vary, which is the opposite of what evolution would require, which is the expansion of genetic variability. If these species are hitting walls, that's not going to really help with large-scale evolution, Jerry. So I'm glad you pointed that out, brother. And so I want to let people know that they can find more from you here. But where I find a large selection of your articles is on Creation Evolution Headlines. So I want to recommend people go there as well, Jerry. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with, the audience, myself, as we wind down and wrap things up here?
No, appreciate the interview. Appreciate my focus is somewhat unusual in the creation movement. I'm looking at the harm that evolution has done. And so I've done a lot of books focusing on that. And I guess others have their other interests, but that's always been my interest, because I guess that was one of the things I became aware of when I was leaving the atheist world and going into the creation world. So, and it just, there seems to be no end at the harm that it's done. And so that's what so many of my articles deal with, documenting.
And that was our last program we did together, The Truth About Charles Darwin. And that was an excellent program too. So I recommend people check it out. Jerry, I appreciate all the work that you've done defending the faith and upholding the truth of biblical creation. So I really do appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, Jerry, and you and I we'll chat about getting together again soon. So God bless you.
Okay.
I hope you have a good walk with your dog there. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.
Okay.